The distant howl of a coyote pierced the darkness as Penelope O'Hara clutched her worn leather satchel tightly against her chest, the stagecoach rattling beneath her as it rolled into the small town of Redemption Creek, Colorado. The year was 1882, and Penelope was down to her last $3.17, barely enough for a decent meal, let alone a place to stay. The advertisement she'd torn from a newspaper in Denver had promised decent wages and accommodations at the Silvercrest Ranch, provided she wasn't afraid of the midnight shift and hard work. At 22, with no family left and nowhere else to turn, she didn't have the luxury of being afraid of anything. "End of the line, miss," the driver called out as the stagecoach came to a halt in front of the town's only hotel, a weathered two-story building with peeling paint and dim lantern light flickering behind dusty windows. Penelope stepped down onto the dirt street, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The night air was cool against her face, a welcome relief after the stuffiness of the coach. She'd been traveling for nearly 2 days, and exhaustion tugged at her bones, but there was no time to rest. The advertisement had specified that the ranch owner would meet prospective workers at the Rusty Nail Saloon at midnight. "Excuse me," she asked the driver as he unloaded luggage from the top of the coach. "Could you point me toward the Rusty Nail Saloon?" The man paused, giving her a once-over that made Penelope stand straighter, adjusting the collar of her plain blue dress. "No place for a lady at this hour," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "2 blocks down, take a right. Can't miss it. The noisiest place in town." Penelope nodded her thanks and started walking, her footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Most businesses were closed at this late hour, though lights spilled from a few saloons and establishments of questionable repute. She kept her eyes forward, ignoring the occasional drunken catcall from men lounging outside the establishments. True to the driver's word, she couldn't miss the Rusty Nail. Piano music and raucous laughter poured from its swinging doors, along with the sharp smell of whiskey and tobacco. Penelope hesitated, her hand gripping the folded advertisement in her pocket. A respectable woman didn't enter such establishments alone, but she wasn't here for pleasure or impropriety. She was here for a job she desperately needed. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the batwing doors. The saloon was crowded with cowboys, miners, and various other men drawn to the frontier. Most gathered around poker tables or the long bar that ran along one wall. Heads turned as she entered, conversation momentarily faltering before resuming with renewed interest. Penelope squared her shoulders and made her way to the bar, ignoring the stares and whispers. The barkeeper, a rotund man with a magnificent mustache, raised an eyebrow as she approached. "I'm looking for the owner of Silvercrest Ranch," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm here about the midnight position," the barkeeper chuckled, wiping a glass with a questionably clean rag. "That'd be Jackson Silvercrest, corner table." He nodded toward the back of the room. Following his gesture, Penelope spotted a man sitting alone at a small table, partially obscured by shadows. He wasn't what she expected. The ranchers she'd encountered during her journey west had been weathered men with leathery skin and gruff demeanors. This man was younger, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders and a stillness about him that seemed out of place amid the saloon's chaos. As she approached, he looked up, and Penelope felt a strange flutter in her chest. His eyes were startlingly blue beneath the brim of his black Stetson, his jawline strong and covered with several days' worth of stubble. He studied her with an intensity that made her want to both step closer and turn away. "Mr. Silvercrest?" she asked, coming to stand before his table. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Have a seat, miss. O'Hara, Penelope O'Hara. She sat down, placing her satchel carefully at her feet. You're here about the job. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep with a slight roughness to it, like he didn't use it often. Yes, sir. I saw your advertisement in Denver. She pulled out the folded paper and placed it on the table between them. It said you needed someone for the midnight to dawn shift. He glanced at the paper, then back at her. It's ranch work, hard work. I'm no stranger to hard work, Mr. Silvercrest. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Call me Jackson. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. Why are you looking for work at this hour, Miss O'Hara? A woman like you could find more suitable employment. Penelope bristled slightly at his assumption. A woman like me, Mr. Silvercrest? You don't know what kind of woman I am. Fair enough. He conceded with a slight nod. Let me rephrase. Why the interest in night work on a cattle ranch? The advertisement promised room and board along with wages. I need a place to stay, and I'm willing to work whatever hours are required. She hesitated, then added, I've worked on a farm before. I know my way around animals. This isn't just any ranch work, Jackson said, his expression unreadable. I need someone to help with the foaling. I've got several mares due to deliver in the coming weeks, and they tend to give birth in the night hours. The position requires someone who can stay alert, recognize when a mare is in distress, and assist if necessary. Someone who won't panic. I delivered my first foal when I was 12, Penelope replied. My father raised quarter horses in Pennsylvania before he passed. I've assisted in more births than I can count. Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or interest. And what brought you west from Pennsylvania, Miss O'Hara? Penelope hesitated. She hadn't expected personal questions, and she certainly wasn't ready to share her story with a stranger. Opportunity, she said simply, and the need for a fresh start. Jackson nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something for him. The job pays $15 a week, plus room and board. You'd have your own cabin on the property, small but private. Days are yours to do with as you please, as long as you're ready for your shift each night. $15 a week was more than she dared hope for. With room and board included, she could save most of it. Perhaps even enough to eventually start her own business, something she'd dreamed of since before everything fell apart back east. When would I start? She asked. Tonight, if you're willing. I've got a mare that's close. He stood, dropping a few coins on the table for his drink. Unless you need time to settle in town first. Penelope rose as well, gathering her satchel. I don't have arrangements in town, Mr. Silvercrest. I can start tonight. For the first time, a genuine smile crossed his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made Penelope's breath catch. Good, he said. My wagon's outside. As they left the saloon, Penelope felt curious eyes following them. A woman leaving with a man at this hour would certainly fuel gossip, but she couldn't afford to care about her reputation. Not when survival was at stake. Jackson's wagon was simple but well-maintained, hitched to two sturdy horses that stomped impatiently in the cool night air. He helped her up onto the wooden seat before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. It's about 4 miles to the ranch, he said, clicking his tongue to set the horses in motion. Not a long ride, but it'll give you time to change your mind if you're having second thoughts. I'm not, Penelope said firmly, though she couldn't help but wonder what she was getting herself into. 4 miles out of town meant isolation. She'd be completely dependent on this stranger, this man she knew nothing about beyond his name and occupation. They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves against the hard-packed dirt road. The town quickly fell behind them, giving way to open country bathed in moonlight. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks silver against the night sky. "May I ask a question, Mr. Silvercrest?" "Jackson," he corrected again. "And yes. Why the midnight shift? Couldn't you hire a regular ranch hand and simply wake them when a mare is ready to foal?" He was quiet for so long that Penelope thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I could, but regular ranch hands come with complications. They want to be cowboys riding the range, working cattle. They're not interested in sitting quietly with a nervous mare for hours on end." He glanced at her briefly. "And most of them lack a gentle touch." Something in the way he said it made Penelope think there was more to his reasoning, but she didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, and she was in no position to pry into his when she was guarding so many of her own. "There it is," Jackson said after they'd traveled for nearly half an hour. "Silvercrest Ranch." Penelope leaned forward, trying to make out the property in the darkness. A large two-story house came into view first, its windows dark except for a single lamp burning on the ground floor. Behind it stretched several outbuildings, a barn, stables, and what looked like bunkhouses for the ranch hands. Beyond that, she could just make out the shapes of cattle in fenced pastures and, further still, horses grazing in the moonlight. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and meant it. There was something peaceful about the place, despite its isolation. Jackson's expression softened slightly. "Been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built that house with his own hands back in '32. The wagon rolled through an open gate and followed a dirt path toward the house." As they drew closer, Penelope noticed a small cabin set apart from the other buildings, with a fresh coat of whitewash gleaming in the moonlight. "That'll be your place," Jackson said, following her gaze. "It's not much, but it's clean. Used to be the foreman's cabin before I built new quarters closer to the bunkhouse." He brought the wagon to a stop near the main house and jumped down, coming around to help Penelope descend. His hands were strong at her waist, lifting her down with an ease that reminded her of just how physically powerful he was. The realization sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I'll show you to your cabin first, let you drop off your things," he said, seemingly unaware of her reaction. "Then we can check on Willow. She's the mare I'm concerned about tonight." The inside of the cabin was indeed small but surprisingly comfortable. A bed with a clean-looking quilt occupied one corner, a small table and 2 chairs another. A cast-iron stove sat against one wall, with a woodbox beside it stocked with split logs. Simple shelves held basic supplies: coffee, flour, sugar, and other staples. A curtained-off area in the back presumably led to washing facilities. "There's a pump out back for water," Jackson explained, lighting a lamp on the table. "Outhouse too. I had Mrs. Bentley, she does the cooking for the ranch hands, stock some basic provisions. You're welcome to take your meals at the main house if you prefer, though the timing might be off with your schedule." "This is more than adequate," Penelope said, genuinely impressed. The cabin was nicer than any accommodation she'd had since leaving Pennsylvania. "Thank you." Jackson nodded, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment before he looked away. "I'll wait outside while you get settled. No rush, Willow's not in active labor yet, just showing signs that it might be soon." Once alone, Penelope took a moment to simply breathe. Everything was happening so quickly. This morning, she'd been in Denver, uncertain of her future. Now she was miles from civilization, preparing to work through the night on a strange ranch for a man she'd just met. It was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she'd ever done. She splashed water on her face from a basin on a small washstand, then changed from her travel dress into a simpler work dress, sturdy cotton in a practical brown that wouldn't show dirt. She pulled her honey blonde hair back into a secure bun and pinched her cheeks to bring some color back into her face. When she stepped outside, Jackson was leaning against a porch post, looking out at the mountains. He straightened when he heard her, and Penelope couldn't help but notice the way his gaze traveled over her, assessing but not in the leering way she'd grown accustomed to from men. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and he led the way toward the stables, a large structure with individual stalls for what looked like at least 20 horses. Inside, lanterns hung from hooks, casting a warm glow over the space. The smell of hay, horses, and leather filled the air, familiar scents that instantly made Penelope feel more at ease. "Willow's in the last stall," Jackson said, leading her down the central aisle. "She's a first-time mother, which makes her more likely to have complications." The mare in question was a beautiful palomino with a flowing mane and intelligent eyes. She paced restlessly in her stall, her swollen belly evidence of her advanced pregnancy. "She's beautiful," Penelope said, approaching the stall slowly to avoid startling the animal. "Best cutting horse I've ever trained," Jackson said, and there was unmistakable pride in his voice. "She's carrying the foal of a champion stallion from back east. Could be worth a small fortune if it inherits the right traits from both parents." Penelope opened the stall door and entered, speaking softly to the mare as she approached. Willow's ears flicked forward with interest, and she allowed Penelope to stroke her neck. "You have a way with horses," Jackson observed from the doorway. "They're honest creatures," Penelope replied, running her hands gently along Willow's sides, feeling the tension in the muscles. "They don't pretend to be something they're not, unlike people." She glanced at him, surprised by the bitterness in his tone. "Some people, perhaps." Jackson's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "I'll show you where everything is kept: medical supplies, clean straw, water. Then I'll leave you to it. I've got some business to attend to, but I'll check back before dawn." For the next hour, he showed her around the stables, explaining the routine and introducing her to the other horses, most of them pregnant mares in various stages, though there were also several working horses and a few young colts. "The rest of the hands know to leave you be unless there's an emergency," Jackson said as they returned to Willow's stall. "They're up at dawn for their own work, so they shouldn't bother you during your shift." "How many hands do you employ?" Penelope asked, curious about the operation. "8 regular hands, plus a foreman, more during roundup season." He paused, then added, "My brother James helps with the business side of things, but he's in Denver this week." It was the first he'd mentioned a family, and Penelope wondered if there were others, a wife, perhaps, though she'd seen no sign of a woman's touch in the main house as they'd passed by. "I should get back to Willow," she said, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the quiet stable. Jackson nodded. "There's coffee in the tack room if you need it, and Penelope—" The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Don't hesitate to ring the bell by the door if there's trouble, day or night." With that, he was gone, leaving Penelope alone with the horses and her thoughts. She returned to Willow's stall, settling onto a small stool in the corner where she could observe the mare while staying out of her way. The night stretched on, quiet except for the occasional neighing of horses and the distant howl of coyotes. Penelope kept a careful eye on Willow, noting the increasing frequency of her pacing and the way she occasionally turned to look at her flank, signs that labor might not be far off. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the mare finally lay down in the fresh straw, her sides heaving with contractions. Penelope moved closer, speaking soothingly as she prepared for the birth. She'd assisted with enough foalings to know what to watch for: the appearance of the amniotic sac, the proper positioning of the foal's legs and head. When the foal finally emerged, a perfect little colt, with his mother's golden coat Penelope, felt a rush of joy that never diminished no matter how many births she witnessed. She cleared the membrane from the foal's nose and mouth, then moved back to let mother and baby bond, watching as Willow nuzzled her newborn, encouraging him to stand on wobbly legs. "Beautiful job," a deep voice said from behind her, startling Penelope from her reverie. Jackson stood in the stall doorway, his expression softer than she'd yet seen it. She hadn't heard him approach, too absorbed in the miracle unfolding before her. "He's perfect," she said, wiping her hands on a clean rag. "Strong lungs, good conformation from what I can see." No assistance needed. Willow knew exactly what to do. Jackson entered the stall, crouching beside the newborn colt with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing physique. He ran a hand over the foal's back, checking its proportions with an expert eye. "You've done this before," he said, looking up at Penelope with newfound respect. "I told you I had. People say a lot of things to get jobs." He stood, his height forcing Penelope to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "But you clearly weren't exaggerating your experience." "I don't exaggerate, Mr. Silvercrest. I don't see the point in it." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Jackson," he corrected for the third time, "and I'm beginning to believe you, Miss O'Hara." The first hints of dawn were lightening the sky outside the stable windows. Penelope suddenly realized she'd been awake for over 24 hours, and exhaustion washed over her in a wave. Jackson must have noticed because he said, "Your shift's almost over. Why don't you head back to your cabin and get some rest? You've more than earned it tonight." "I should clean up first," Penelope protested, looking at the soiled straw. "I'll take care of it. Go on." His tone was gentle but firm. Too tired to argue, Penelope nodded and made her way out of the stable into the cool morning air. The ranch was coming to life around her, lights appearing in the bunkhouse windows, the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from what must be the cookhouse. A few ranch hands nodded respectfully to her as they headed toward the barn, curious but not overly so. The cabin welcomed her with its simple comforts. Penelope barely managed to wash her face and hands before collapsing onto the bed, still fully clothed. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Jackson's face when he'd seen the newborn colt, the way his stern features had transformed with wonder and pride. There was more to the man than his gruff exterior suggested. Much more, she suspected. And despite her determination to keep her distance and focus on saving money, Penelope couldn't deny a spark of curiosity about the enigmatic rancher who had hired her to work the midnight shift. As sleep claimed her, she didn't know that Jackson Silvercrest stood outside the main house, watching the smoke begin to curl from her cabin's chimney, a strange expression on his face like a man who'd been waiting a very long time for something, and was only now allowing himself to hope it might finally have arrived. The days that followed settled into a rhythm unlike any Penelope had known before. She slept through most of the daylight hours, rising in the late afternoon to eat a solitary meal and prepare for her night's work. The work itself was peaceful most nights. She simply checked on the pregnant mares hourly, noting their conditions in a ledger Jackson had provided. Only twice more in that first week did a mare give birth, and both deliveries went smoothly. Jackson remained something of a mystery. He appeared periodically during her shifts, sometimes staying to talk for a while, other times merely checking in before disappearing again. She learned little snippets about him: that he'd taken over the ranch when his father died 5 years earlier, that he preferred working with horses to cattle though the latter were more profitable, that he'd never traveled further east than St. Louis. What he didn't speak of was equally telling: no mention of a wife or sweetheart, no references to friends or social engagements. He seemed as solitary as she was, though by choice rather than circumstance. On her 7th night at Silvercrest Ranch, Penelope was making her rounds when the stable door swung open, admitting a gust of cool air and Jackson, who looked more disheveled than usual. "Evening," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Any activity tonight?" "Starlight seems restless, but I don't think she's ready yet," Penelope replied, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "Is everything all right?" Jackson sighed, leaning against a post. "Had some trouble with rustlers near the north pasture. Lost a dozen head before we ran them off." "No one was hurt, I hope?" "No, thankfully, though not for lack of trying on their part." He gestured to a tear in his shirt sleeve that Penelope hadn't noticed. "Just a graze." She stepped closer without thinking, concern overriding her usual caution. "Let me see." He looked surprised but extended his arm. Penelope gently pushed up the sleeve to reveal a shallow cut along his upper arm, crusted with dried blood. "This needs cleaning," she said firmly. "The tack room has a first aid kit, doesn't it?" Jackson nodded, and Penelope led the way, lighting an extra lamp when they reached the small room. She gestured for him to sit on a wooden stool while she gathered supplies: clean water, soap, bandages. "This might sting," she warned as she began cleaning the wound. He didn't flinch, though she knew it must be painful. "Where did you learn medical skills?" he asked, watching her work. Penelope kept her eyes on the task. "My mother died when I was young. I had to learn to take care of my father and brothers when they were injured." "And where are they now?" "Your father and brothers." The question caught her off guard, and she paused briefly before continuing to wrap a clean bandage around his arm. "They died. Influenza, 3 years ago." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. My father was taken by the same epidemic." "It was a bad year," Penelope said simply, tying off the bandage. "There. That should heal cleanly as long as you keep it dry and clean." He flexed his arm, testing the bandage. "Thank you." His blue eyes met hers, unexpectedly warm. "You're a woman of many talents, Penelope O'Hara." The way he said her name made her pulse quicken. They were standing too close in the small tack room, the lamplight casting a golden glow over his features. For a breathless moment, Penelope thought he might lean closer, might do something to bridge the gap between employer and employee that she'd been so careful to maintain. Instead, he straightened, putting a respectful distance between them. "I should let you get back to your rounds. I just wanted to warn you that I've posted extra men on watch tonight, so you might hear some movement around the property." "Of course," Penelope said, gathering up the medical supplies to hide her confusion. Had she imagined that moment of connection? "I'll keep an eye out." Jackson paused at the door. "Would you join me for dinner tomorrow at the main house? My brother's returned from Denver and he's curious about the new midnight helper who's proven so capable." The invitation surprised her. "I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's a proper meal at a proper table, which I suspect you haven't had since you arrived." When she hesitated, he added, "Consider it part of your duties if that makes it easier to accept." Penelope couldn't help but smile at his persistence. "In that case, I accept." "Good. 6 o'clock." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll leave you to your work." After he left, Penelope leaned against the tack room wall, her heart beating too quickly for simple medical assistance. She was treading dangerous ground. Jackson Silvercrest was her employer, not a potential suitor. She'd come west to rebuild her life, to find independence after losing everything. Developing feelings for a man, any man, was not part of that plan. Yet as she resumed her rounds, checking on the pregnant mares with mechanical efficiency, Penelope couldn't stop thinking about the dinner invitation. About seeing Jackson in a social setting rather than the professional one they'd maintained thus far. About meeting his brother and learning more about the family that had built this ranch. It was curiosity, she told herself firmly. Nothing more. And certainly nothing that would interfere with her plans to save money and eventually move on to a life that was truly her own. The next evening found Penelope standing before the small mirror in her cabin, frowning at her reflection. She'd washed her hair and pinned it in a more flattering style than her usual practical bun, and she'd put on her one good dress, a dark green cotton with a lace collar that had once belonged to her mother. It wasn't fashionable, but it was the best she had. "This is merely dinner with your employer," she told her reflection sternly. "Not a social call. Certainly not a courtship." Still, she couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation as she made her way to the main house as the clock approached 6. She'd seen little of the property during daylight hours, and the ranch looked different in the golden evening light, more inviting, less intimidating than it had appeared on that first night. The main house was an impressive structure up close, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Flower beds lined the walkway, filled with hardy western blooms that added splashes of color to the otherwise practical dwelling. Penelope climbed the porch steps and hesitated for just a moment before knocking on the solid oak door. It swung open almost immediately, revealing Jackson in a clean shirt and vest, his hair still damp from washing. His eyes widened slightly as they took in her appearance. "Penelope," he said, and something in his voice made her cheeks warm. "Please come in." The interior of the house was a surprise. Where she'd expected bachelor simplicity, she found tasteful furnishings and an attention to comfort that spoke of a real home. The entryway opened to a large living area dominated by a stone fireplace, with comfortable-looking chairs and a sofa arranged for conversation. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that made Penelope's fingers itch to explore them. "This is lovely," she said honestly. Jackson looked pleased. "My mother had a hand in most of it. She was determined that a ranch house didn't have to be Spartan. She had excellent taste, that she did." A new voice joined the conversation as a man entered from what appeared to be a dining room. In everything except her choice of husband, some might argue. The newcomer was unmistakably Jackson's brother, though where Jackson was all hard angles and intensity, James Silvercrest had an easier manner about him. His eyes were the same striking blue, but they held a warmth and humor that made his handsome face immediately approachable. "James, this is Miss Penelope O'Hara," Jackson said. "Penelope, my brother James." James stepped forward, taking her hand and bowing over it with a flourish that seemed designed to make her smile. "The famous Midnight Helper. Jackson's been singing your praises since I returned. I was beginning to think he'd invented you." "James," Jackson said warningly, but his brother just grinned. "What? It's true. Finest hand with horses I've ever seen," he said. "Delivered Willow's colt without batting an eye, on and on. I had to see for myself." Penelope glanced at Jackson, surprised to see a flush creeping up his neck. "Your brother exaggerates," she said to James. "I've simply been doing the job I was hired to do." "And doing it exceptionally well by all accounts," James replied. "Come, dinner's ready. Mrs. Potter, our housekeeper, has prepared a feast in your honor." The dining room was as tasteful as the rest of the house, with a polished oak table set for 3 with fine china and crystal glasses that looked out of place on a cattle ranch. A plump, gray-haired woman was just setting down a large platter of roast beef as they entered. "Ah, this must be the young lady," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and coming forward to inspect Penelope. "I'm Mrs. Potter, dear. Glad to finally meet you. Been curious about the girl brave enough to take on the midnight shift. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Potter," Penelope said, warming to the woman's motherly manner. "Everything smells wonderful." Well, sit down, sit down. Don't let it get cold. She shooed them toward their chairs, Jackson pulling out Penelope's for her with unexpected gallantry. The meal was indeed a feast compared to the simple fare Penelope had been preparing for herself. Roast beef with gravy, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables from what must be a kitchen garden, and warm rolls with butter. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed proper cooking until the first bite melted in her mouth. Conversation flowed more easily than she'd expected. James carried much of it, sharing stories from his business trip to Denver and asking Penelope questions about her background that were interested without being intrusive. Jackson was quieter, but his eyes rarely left her face, and he smiled more than she'd seen in their previous encounters. "So, Miss O'Hara," James said as Mrs. Potter served apple pie for dessert, "what brought you all the way from Pennsylvania to our little corner of Colorado?" Penelope hesitated, setting down her fork. She'd avoided details about her past since arriving, but sitting here in this warm dining room with the Silvercrest brothers, the evasion suddenly felt wrong. "After my family died," she began, "I found myself in difficult circumstances. My father had debts I wasn't aware of and the farm was heavily mortgaged. When he passed, the bank foreclosed." She took a breath, the memories still painful. "I tried to find work in town, but options for a single woman were limited." "So you came west," Jackson said softly. Penelope nodded. "I worked my way across the country, a seamstress in Ohio, a teacher's assistant in Missouri, a shop girl in Kansas. I was in Denver working at a laundry when I saw your advertisement." She looked up, meeting Jackson's gaze. "The midnight shift didn't scare me. After everything else, it seemed like a blessing, honest work that I was qualified for." James was watching his brother with an odd expression. "Funny how things work out, isn't it, Jack? You put that advertisement in the paper on a whim and look who answered it." There was something in his tone that made Penelope glance between the brothers, sensing an undercurrent she didn't understand. "It wasn't a whim," Jackson said, his eyes still on Penelope. "It was exactly what the ranch needed." The moment stretched, charged with something Penelope couldn't name. Then Mrs. Potter bustled in with coffee, breaking the tension. After dinner, James excused himself, claiming paperwork that needed attention, though the look he gave his brother as he left the room suggested other motives for his departure. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Jackson asked as they finished their coffee. Penelope nodded, and he led her on a tour of the spacious dwelling, the study where the ranch business was conducted, the kitchen where Mrs. Potter reigned supreme, and finally, a small room at the back of the house filled with books. "My mother's library," Jackson explained as Penelope ran her fingers along the spines with undisguised longing. "She was a great reader, used to order books from as far away as New York and San Francisco." "It's wonderful," Penelope said, pulling out a volume of Tennyson's poems. "I haven't had access to books like these since I left Pennsylvania." "You're welcome to borrow anything that interests you," Jackson said, watching her with a gentle expression she'd never seen before. "They're just gathering dust otherwise." Penelope looked up at him, touched by the offer. "That's very kind, thank you. It's nothing." He hesitated, then said, "Penelope, there's something I should tell you." There was a seriousness in his tone that made her close the book, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" Before he could continue, the door burst open and one of the ranch hands appeared, his face flushed with exertion. "Boss, sorry to interrupt, but we've got trouble. Rustlers again, north pasture. Pete thinks it's the same bunch from yesterday, back with reinforcements." Jackson's expression hardened instantly. "Get the men, I'll be right there." As the hand disappeared, he turned back to Penelope with regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, this will have to wait." "Of course," she said, setting the book aside. I should get to the stables anyway. It's nearly time for my shift. He walked her to the door, the easy companionship of the evening giving way to the urgency of the situation. Stay close to the stables tonight, he said as they stepped onto the porch. If you hear gunfire, go to your cabin and lock the door. The concern in his voice warmed her even as it sent a chill of fear down her spine. Be careful, Jackson. He caught her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. I will, and Penelope, thank you for coming tonight. It meant a lot to have you here. Then he was gone, striding toward the bunkhouse where men were already gathering with rifles and grim expressions. Penelope watched him go, her hand still tingling from his touch, before turning reluctantly toward the stables and her waiting duties. The night was tense, with distant sounds of shouting and occasional gunfire drifting from the north end of the property. Penelope tried to focus on her work, checking the mares methodically and making notes in the ledger, but her thoughts kept straying to Jackson and the danger he might be facing. It was well past midnight when she heard horses approaching the stable, not at a gallop, which eased her immediate fear, but still moving with purpose. She stepped outside, lantern raised, to see Jackson dismounting from his stallion, his expression weary but satisfied. You caught them? She asked as he approached. Most of them. A couple got away, but they won't be back. He rubbed a hand over his face, and Penelope noticed a fresh bruise forming along his jawline. You're hurt, she said, moving closer to examine it in the lantern light. It's nothing. One of them got in a lucky punch before I put him down. He caught her concerned look and added, not permanently. We've got 5 of them tied up in the barn, sheriffs coming from town to collect them in the morning. Relief washed over her. I'm glad you're safe. His eyes softened as they met hers. Were you worried about me, Penelope O'Hara? Of course I was, she admitted, too tired for pretense. You've been kind to me. I wouldn't want to see you hurt. Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a vulnerability breaking through his usual reserve. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. What I wanted to tell you earlier, he said, his voice low. Before we were interrupted, it's about why I placed that advertisement, why I needed someone for the midnight shift specifically. Penelope's heart quickened. Why? Because I haven't slept properly in 5 years, he said simply. Not since my father died and the responsibility for this place fell to me. Every creak, every sound has me up checking the stock, the property. I needed someone I could trust to watch over things so I could finally rest. The confession surprised her. And you trust me. You barely know me. I know enough. His eyes never left hers. I knew the moment you walked into that saloon in town, head high despite the stares, determined to make your own way. I knew you were different. Penelope shook her head, not understanding. Different how? Honest, capable, unafraid of hard work or unconventional arrangements. He paused, then added more softly, beautiful though you don't trade on it. Kind though life has given you reasons not to be. His words left her breathless, uncertain how to respond. This wasn't the gruff rancher who had hired her, nor the polite host from dinner. This was a man revealing something raw and personal, something that made her own carefully guarded heart beat faster. Jackson. A commotion from inside the stable interrupted her, the distinctive sounds of a mare in distress. Instantly, both of them turned toward the sound, personal revelations forgotten in the face of immediate need. It's Starlight, Penelope said, already moving toward the stable doors. She's been restless all night. They found the black mare in her stall, down on her side and straining, her eyes rolling with panic. One look told Penelope this wasn't going to be an easy birth like Willow's had been. Something's wrong, she said, kneeling beside the mare to check her condition. The foal's not positioned correctly. I can feel a hoof, but not the nose. Jackson was already rolling up his sleeves. What do you need? Clean water, towels, the long gloves from the medical kit. She was slipping into the focused state that emergencies required, all personal concerns set aside. And pray she doesn't panic when I have to reach in to adjust the foal. The next 2 hours were a blur of tense effort. Penelope worked with a calm efficiency born of experience, guiding the mispositioned foal back into the birth canal, and then helping to ease it into the world as Starlight strained and whinnied in pain. Jackson worked alongside her, anticipating her needs, providing steady support both to her and to the frightened mare. When the foal finally emerged, a leggy black colt with a white star on his forehead, both Penelope and Jackson were soaked with sweat and spattered with blood and fluids. But the sight of the newborn struggling to his feet, while his exhausted mother nuzzled him, made every moment of the ordeal worthwhile. "You did it," Jackson said, his voice filled with admiration as they watched the new life they'd helped bring into the world. "We did it," Penelope corrected, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how intimately they'd worked together through the crisis. "I couldn't have managed alone." Jackson turned to her, and despite the mess and exhaustion, she'd never seen him look more handsome, his guard completely down, his blue eyes bright with shared accomplishment. "Penelope," he said, and it sounded like a caress. "Aye, boss." The shout came from outside, followed by the appearance of the foreman in the stable doorway. "Sheriff's here for those rustlers." Jackson closed his eyes briefly, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. "Tell him I'll be right there." When they were alone again, he looked back at Penelope with regret. "I have to go, but we need to finish our conversation. Soon." She nodded, too emotionally and physically drained to process everything that had happened: the dinner, his confession about the advertisement, the intensity of the foaling, and the unmistakable connection that had grown between them throughout it all. "Go," she said. "I'll clean up here and check on Starlight and her foal in a little while." He hesitated, then leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead so quick she might have imagined it if not for the tingling warmth it left behind. "Thank you," he said softly, and then he was gone, leaving Penelope alone with a new mother, a newborn foal, and the growing certainty that her carefully laid plans for independence were about to become much more complicated. The following days brought a shift in the atmosphere at Silvercrest Ranch. Jackson sought out Penelope's company more frequently, stopping by the stables during her shift not just to check on the horses, but to talk about books they'd both read, about his plans for expanding the horse breeding program, about her experiences traveling west. Sometimes James joined them, his easy charm and obvious approval of their growing friendship making these encounters feel almost like family gatherings. A week after the dinner at the main house, Penelope was in her cabin preparing for her shift when a knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Jackson standing on the porch, holding the reins of 2 saddled horses. "It's a beautiful afternoon," he said, looking unusually nervous. "I thought you might like to see more of the property before your shift starts." Penelope hesitated. She'd been careful to maintain some professional distance despite their growing closeness, aware of how vulnerable her position was. But the hopeful look in his eyes was impossible to resist. "I'd like that," she said, reaching for her shawl. "Just let me change into my riding skirt." The ranch was even more impressive in daylight than she'd imagined. They rode across rolling pastures where cattle grazed, through stands of aspen trees where their leaves shimmered gold in the late summer breeze, and finally up to a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. "It's breathtaking," Penelope said as they dismounted to rest the horses. The view stretched for miles, the ranch buildings below, the town of Redemption Creek in the distance, and mountains rising majestically beyond. "My grandfather chose this spot for a reason," Jackson said, coming to stand beside her. "He said a man should be able to see what he's working for." He was a wise man, in some ways. Jackson's expression grew thoughtful, in others not so much. "He worked himself into an early grave trying to build something impressive. My father did the same." Penelope glanced at him. "And you, I'm trying to learn from their mistakes." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Penelope, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been trying to say for days now, but we keep getting interrupted." Her heart quickened. "I'm listening." Jackson took a deep breath. "That advertisement, the one for the midnight position. I didn't place it because I needed help with the foaling, though that part was true enough. I placed it because of a letter." Penelope frowned, confused. "A letter from my mother." He looked out over the valley again, as if gathering his thoughts. "Before she died, she wrote letters to both James and me. Instructions, really, about what she wanted for us after she was gone. She made us promise not to read them until 5 years had passed since her death." "And it's been 5 years," Penelope guessed. Jackson nodded. "This spring, April 17th to be exact, I opened her letter that morning and it changed everything." "What did it say?" He smiled slightly. "A lot of things. That she loved me. That she was proud of the man I was becoming. That she worried I was too much like my father, too focused on the ranch, too closed off from the rest of the world." His voice softened. "And that her greatest regret was that she wouldn't live to see me find happiness with someone who could match my strength with her own." Penelope's breath caught as the implications of his words began to sink in. "She made me promise to open myself to possibility," Jackson continued. "To look for a partner, not just a wife. Someone who could stand beside me, not behind me." He turned to Penelope, his blue eyes intent. "I placed that advertisement the next day, not because I expected to find her through it, but because my mother was right. I needed help. I needed to admit I couldn't do everything alone. And then I walked into the saloon," Penelope said softly, "and then you walked in." His expression held a wonder that made her heart ache. Independent, capable, and so beautiful it nearly stopped my heart. Everything I hadn't known I was looking for until that moment. Penelope shook her head, overwhelmed. "Jackson, you don't know me, not really." "I know enough," he said, echoing his words from the night of the rustlers. "I know you're brave enough to cross a country alone rather than accept defeat. I know you're skilled enough to deliver a breech foal in the middle of the night without panic. I know you read poetry and speak gently to frightened animals and stand up to men twice your size without flinching." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "I know I've slept better since you arrived than I have in years, and not just because someone else is watching the horses at night." "Why?" she whispered. "Because for the first time, I believe there might be a future for me that includes more than just this land and these animals." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he took her hand in his. "A future that includes someone to share it with." Penelope's mind was spinning. She'd come west to find independence, to build a life on her own terms after losing everything. The last thing she'd expected was to find a man who saw her strength as an asset rather than a threat, who valued her skills and her mind as much as her appearance. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything right now," Jackson assured her. "I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. I'm just telling you how I feel, that I care for you, Penelope, that I'd like to court you properly if you'll allow it." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a passing fancy or a convenient arrangement. This was a man offering his heart with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything else. "I came west to be independent," she said slowly. to never again be at the mercy of others' decisions. I know, and I would never ask you to give that up. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. This ranch needs someone like you, not just for the midnight shift, but for all of it. Someone with fresh ideas and a different perspective. Someone who sees possibilities I might miss. A partner, Penelope said, the word sending a thrill through her. Exactly. Hope brightened his features. Is that something you might consider, not right away, but eventually? Penelope looked out over the valley, at the ranch spread below them in the golden afternoon light. She thought about the past weeks, the peaceful nights in the stables, the growing connection with Jackson and James, the sense of purpose she'd found in her work. She'd come seeking a job and found the beginnings of a home. I'm not ready to make promises, she said honestly, but I'm not opposed to the idea of getting to know you better, of seeing where this might lead. The smile that spread across Jackson's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. That's all I'm asking for. Time. A chance. Impulsively, Penelope reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath her fingers. You're not what I expected when I answered that advertisement, Jackson Silvercrest, nor you, Penelope O'Hara. His eyes darkened as they dropped to her lips. May I? She nodded, and he leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss so gentle it made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. His hand came up to cradle her face, and hers found its way to his shoulder, steadying herself against the rush of emotion. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. We should head back, he said reluctantly. Your shift will be starting soon. Penelope nodded, though she was loath to break the moment. They mounted their horses and rode back toward the ranch buildings in a companionable silence, the setting sun painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. As they approached the stables, Penelope noticed James standing on the porch of the main house, watching their return with undisguised satisfaction. He raised a hand in greeting, and Jackson returned the gesture with a smile that told Penelope his brother had likely been privy to his intentions from the start. Will you have dinner with us again tomorrow? Jackson asked as he helped her dismount. Mrs. Potter's been asking when you'll return. I think she's determined to fatten you up, Penelope laughed. I'd like that. Though I should warn you, if she keeps cooking like she did last time, I may not fit through the stable doors soon. I'll risk it, he said, his eyes warm with affection. Until tomorrow, then. He kissed her hand before leading the horses away, leaving Penelope to prepare for her shift with a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt in years. The future that had once seemed so carefully planned, save money, move on, build a small business of her own, now held new possibilities. Possibilities that included Silvercrest Ranch, midnight shifts watching over new life, and a man who saw her exactly as she was and wanted her anyway. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and courtship. True to his word, Jackson didn't rush her, content to spend time together when her schedule allowed. They rode the property in the evenings before her shift, shared meals with James and occasionally the foreman, and spent quiet hours in the library, where Penelope discovered that Jackson was as well read as she, despite his rugged exterior. She learned more about him with each passing day, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was truly comfortable, that he could recite Shakespeare from memory, a result of his mother's insistence on education, that he was fiercely protective of those he considered under his care, which now clearly included her. In turn, she shared more of herself than she had with anyone since leaving Pennsylvania. She told him about her brothers William and Henry, both lost within days of each other to the influenza that had ravaged their town. About her father's descent into despair afterward, his neglect of the farm leading to the debts that eventually consumed what little they had left. about her determination to never again be dependent on someone else's strength to survive. "Yet here I am," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset. "Working for you, living in your cabin." "Working with me," Jackson corrected. "And that cabin is yours for as long as you want it, regardless of anything else between us." She looked at him curiously. "You're very careful not to make me feel obligated, because you're not." His expression was serious. "Penelope, you could leave tomorrow and find work anywhere. You're staying because you choose to, not because you have to. That's important to me." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "My parents' marriage was complicated. They loved each other, I believe that. But my mother came from Eastern money. When she married my father and moved west, she gave up everything familiar. Her family, her social circle, her way of life." He frowned slightly. "I think she felt trapped sometimes, especially after James and I were born, like she couldn't leave even if she wanted to. And you're afraid I would feel the same," Penelope guessed. "I don't ever want someone to stay with me out of necessity rather than choice," he said simply. "Especially not you." His honesty touched her deeply. Every day, it seemed, Jackson revealed another layer of the thoughtful, principled man beneath the stern rancher exterior. A man she was finding increasingly difficult to imagine leaving behind when the time came to move on. If that time came at all, a small voice whispered in her mind. The midnight shift continued to be her responsibility, though now Jackson often joined her for part of it, the two of them sitting together in the quiet stables, talking or simply enjoying each other's presence. The pregnant mares delivered one by one, each foal a testament to the cycle of life that continued regardless of human concerns. As August gave way to September, Penelope realized she'd been at Silvercrest Ranch for nearly 2 months longer than she'd stayed anywhere since leaving Pennsylvania. The thought didn't frighten her as it once might have. Instead, she found herself noticing the changing seasons with a sense of anticipation rather than restlessness. It was on a crisp September evening, with the first hints of autumn coloring the aspen leaves, that Jackson suggested a ride to a different part of the property than they'd visited before. "There's something I want to show you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that piqued Penelope's curiosity. They rode west from the main ranch buildings, following a stream that wound through a wooded area before opening into a small meadow nestled against the foothills. In the center of the meadow stood a half-built structure, the foundation and framework of what looked to be a modest house. "What is this?" Penelope asked as they dismounted. Jackson ran a hand along one of the wooden beams. "A project I started this spring, after my mother's letter." He turned to face her. "I realized I'd been living in my father's house, running my father's ranch, continuing his legacy without ever really making any of it mine." Penelope looked around with new interest. "So you decided to build your own house?" "Eventually, yes." He gestured toward the surrounding meadow. "This land has always been my favorite part of the ranch. When I was a boy, I'd come here to think, to be alone. I decided if I ever had a family of my own, this is where I'd want to raise them." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Penelope walked around the partially constructed building, running her hands over the rough wood, trying to envision the finished house. "It's a beautiful spot," she said finally. "Peaceful. That's what I thought." Jackson watched her carefully. "The plans include a library, smaller than my mother's but with better light for reading, and a proper kitchen. Not that I can cook worth a damn, but I thought, well, I hoped whoever shared it with me might appreciate the space." Penelope's heart quickened. This wasn't just a house he was showing her, it was a future. A possibility. Her eyes met his, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope he was trying not to press upon her. Jackson, she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. He closed the distance between them in a few strides, taking her hands in his. I'm not asking for an answer today, Penelope. I just wanted you to see it, to know that I'm building something new here, not just continuing what was, that there's room for change, for growth. His voice softened. For you, if you want it. The tenderness in his eyes undid her carefully maintained composure. Penelope rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the conflicting emotions she couldn't yet put into words: gratitude for his patience, amazement at his understanding, and the deepening affection that grew stronger with each passing day. His arms went around her, pulling her close as he returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, the look in his eyes nearly stopped her heart, desire mixed with a reverence that made her feel both powerful and precious. We should head back, she said reluctantly. My shift, I've arranged for James to cover the first few hours tonight, Jackson said, his voice rough. If that's all right with you. The implication was clear and heat bloomed in Penelope's cheeks. Yes, she said simply. That's all right with me. They rode back more slowly than they'd come, the horses picking their way through the deepening twilight, neither rider in a hurry to end this moment of understanding between them. When they reached the stables, Jackson helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. Would you like to come to the house? He asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the heat in his eyes. For dinner, or whatever you're comfortable with. Penelope considered her answer carefully. She'd been raised with clear ideas about propriety, about what was acceptable between a man and a woman who weren't married. But she'd also learned in the past 3 years that life was unpredictable and often short. That happiness, when found, should be embraced. Yes, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. I'd like that very much. The main house was quiet when they entered, James having tactfully made himself scarce. Jackson led her to the library, where a fire had been lit in the fireplace and a bottle of wine waited on a small table. James, Jackson explained with a rueful smile, he's been rather invested in this, in us. I've noticed, Penelope said, accepting the glass of wine he poured for her. He watches us sometimes like he's waiting for something. Jackson took a sip of his own wine before answering. My brother received a letter from our mother too. I don't know exactly what it said, but I gather she was concerned about both of us, about our happiness. He set his glass down and moved closer to her. James has been happier since you arrived as well. He says the ranch feels like a home again, not just a business. Because of me, Penelope asked, surprised. Because of how I am when I'm with you. Jackson's hand came up to touch her cheek. Apparently I'm easier to be around when I'm not scowling all the time. Penelope laughed, leaning into his touch. You do scowl quite impressively. Not with you, he said softly. Never with you. The air between them charged with tension, not the uncomfortable kind, but the heady anticipation of boundaries about to be crossed. Penelope set her wine aside and stepped closer, eliminating the last bit of space between them. Jackson, she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before his arms were around her, pulling her against his chest as his mouth found hers in a kiss that contained none of the restraint of their previous encounters. This was passion unleashed, desire given free rein, and Penelope responded in kind, her hands tangling in his hair as she pressed herself closer. I've been in love with you since the moment you walked into that saloon, Jackson confessed when they broke apart, his breath warm against her ear. Too soon, I know. Impossible, really, but true all the same. Penelope pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. Not impossible, she whispered. Unexpected, perhaps, but not impossible. His answering smile was radiant. "Stay with me tonight," he said, the words both a question and a plea. "Not just for your shift. Stay here with me." The proper answer would have been no, the expected answer from a woman raised as she had been. But Penelope was no longer that sheltered farm girl from Pennsylvania. She was a woman who had crossed a continent alone, who had faced hardship and persevered, who had found something precious and unexpected in this remote corner of Colorado. "Yes," she said, and sealed her answer with a kiss that held promises of much more to come. The hours that followed were a revelation. Jackson was as tender in love as he was passionate, his hands and lips exploring her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. In his arms, Penelope discovered aspects of herself she hadn't known existed, a capacity for abandon, for joy, for complete trust in another person. Later, lying in his bed with her head on his chest and his arms around her, Penelope felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before her family's deaths. The midnight shift was long forgotten, the responsibilities of the ranch set aside for this moment of connection. "What are you thinking?" Jackson asked, his fingers trailing lazily up and down her bare arm. Penelope smiled against his skin. "That I came west looking for independence and found something else entirely." "Have you lost your independence by finding me?" he asked, and there was a genuine question beneath the words. She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "No," she said thoughtfully. "I don't think I have. That's what makes this so different from anything I expected. You don't want to own me or control me. You want to walk beside me." "Always," he said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "For as long as you'll let me." The depth of emotion in his eyes nearly overwhelmed her. "I think that might be a very long time, Jackson Silvercrest." His kiss was answer enough, and soon words were forgotten again as they lost themselves in each other, the night stretching endlessly before them. When dawn broke, painting the room in soft golden light, Penelope woke to find Jackson watching her, his expression one of wonder. "You're really here," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I half expected to wake and find I'd dreamed you." She reached out to touch his face, the stubble rough beneath her fingertips. "Not a dream." "No," he agreed, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Much better than any dream." They dressed slowly, reluctant to break the intimate cocoon they'd created. The ranch would be coming to life around them, hands beginning their day's work, animals needing attention, reality intruding on their private world. "I should check on Starlight and her foal," Penelope said as she pinned up her hair, aware of Jackson's eyes following her movements in the mirror. "And I have a meeting with the cattle buyer from Denver," he said reluctantly. "But dinner tonight? Here." The eagerness in his voice made her smile. "Yes, though perhaps we should invite James as well. I wouldn't want him to feel excluded." Jackson came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and meeting her eyes in the mirror. "My brother will be delighted that his matchmaking has succeeded. He'll be insufferable about it." "Matchmaking?" Penelope turned in his arms, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly has James been up to?" "Let's just say he's been encouraging me since the day you arrived." Jackson's expression turned more serious. "He saw what I was trying not to admit to myself, that you were everything I'd been waiting for without knowing it." The words sent a warm glow through Penelope's chest. "Since spring," she said, recalling something James had said during their dinner weeks ago. "That's what he meant, isn't it?" "When he said you'd placed the advertisement on a whim," Jackson nodded. "Since April 17th, when I read my mother's letter. Though if I'm being completely honest, I think I've been waiting much longer than that. Waiting for someone who could see me, the real me, not just the ranch owner or the boss." "I see you," Penelope said softly, "and I like what I see very much." His kiss was gentle this time, a promise rather than a passion. "We should go before I'm tempted to keep you here all day," he said, reluctantly releasing her. They left the house, separately, Penelope heading to the stables to check on the horses she'd neglected during the night. Jackson toward the main barn where the foreman would be waiting with the day's assignments for the hands. But the glance they shared before parting was filled with understanding and anticipation of the evening to come. The days that followed settled into a new pattern. Penelope continued the midnight shift, but now Jackson often joined her, the two of them working side by side in comfortable companionship. She spent her days exploring the ranch, reading in the library, or helping Mrs. Potter with household tasks that the older woman claimed were too much for her aging bones, but that Penelope suspected were simply excuses to keep her company. James proved to be exactly as insufferable as Jackson had predicted, his knowing smiles and occasional teasing comments making it clear that he heartily approved of the relationship developing between his brother and the midnight helper. But beneath the teasing was a genuine warmth that made Penelope feel increasingly at home at Silvercrest Ranch. It was James who suggested, as September gave way to October and the first frost silvered the grass each morning, that they hold a harvest dance at the ranch. "We used to do it every year when Mother was alive," he explained over dinner one evening. "Invite folks from town, have music and dancing in the barn. It was her favorite tradition. We haven't had the time or inclination since she passed," Jackson added, his eyes on Penelope. "But perhaps it's time to revive the custom." The suggestion took root, and soon preparations were underway. Invitations were sent to townspeople and neighboring ranches. The barn was cleaned and decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty, and Mrs. Potter embarked on a baking frenzy that filled the house with delicious aromas from dawn till dusk. Penelope threw herself into the preparations with unexpected enthusiasm. She'd had little opportunity for social gatherings in recent years, and the prospect of a dance, especially one where she would be openly acknowledged as Jackson's companion, filled her with a girlish excitement she'd thought long behind her. "You need a new dress, Mrs. Potter declared a week before the event, eyeing Penelope's limited wardrobe with disapproval. "Can't have you wearing that green thing again, not for the first Silvercrest harvest dance in 5 years. Before Penelope could protest, the housekeeper had bundled her into a wagon and driven them to town, where the dressmaker's shop yielded a bolt of rich burgundy silk that Mrs. Potter declared just the thing to complement your coloring, dear. "It's too expensive," Penelope objected as the dressmaker took her measurements. "Nonsense," Mrs. Potter said firmly. "Jackson insisted, said to put it on the ranch account and not to let you argue about it." The thought of Jackson arranging this, wanting to see her in something beautiful, quieted Penelope's protests. She allowed herself to be measured and fitted, the dressmaker promising to have the gown ready in time for the dance. When the day of the harvest dance arrived, Penelope found herself more nervous than she'd been since her first night at the ranch. The burgundy silk dress was indeed beautiful, simpler than the elaborate fashions worn in eastern cities, but elegant in its clean lines and rich color. Mrs. Potter had insisted on doing her hair, arranging it in a sophisticated style that made Penelope feel like a different woman from the one who'd stepped off the stagecoach 2 months earlier. "There," the older woman said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "You're a vision, Miss Penelope." Jackson won't know what hit him. Looking in the mirror, Penelope hardly recognized herself. Gone was the practical, no-nonsense woman who'd worked her way across the country. In her place stood someone who looked like she belonged in the library of a fine ranch house, like she might someday preside over a harvest dance as mistress rather than guest. The thought should have frightened her, this glimpse of a future so different from what she'd planned. Instead, it filled her with a quiet excitement, a sense of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to consider until now. The barn was transformed when she arrived, lanterns casting a warm glow over the space cleared for dancing. A small group of musicians from town had set up in one corner, playing lively tunes that had several couples already twirling across the floor. Tables laden with food and drink lined the walls, and everywhere people were laughing, talking, celebrating the season's bounty. Penelope paused in the doorway, suddenly shy. Most of these people were strangers to her, townspeople and neighboring ranchers who knew nothing about her, except what rumors might have spread about the woman working the midnight shift at Silvercrest Ranch. Then Jackson appeared at her side, handsome in a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the blue of his eyes. The way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the crowded barn, chased away any nervousness. "You're beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "Though you always are, even in the stables at 3 in the morning." Penelope smiled, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Silvercrest." He led her into the barn, and she was aware of curious glances, of conversations pausing as they passed. But any discomfort faded as Jackson introduced her proudly to neighbors and friends, his hand warm at the small of her back, his voice clear as he presented her not as an employee but as someone important to him. "May I have this dance?" he asked, as the musicians struck up a waltz. "I'm a bit out of practice," Penelope admitted as he led her to the dance floor. "It's been years since I attended anything like this." "Just follow my lead," Jackson said, drawing her into his arms. "My mother insisted both James and I learn properly. Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo." Penelope laughed, and then they were moving together, turning in perfect harmony as if they'd danced together 100 times before. She was vaguely aware of other couples around them, of James dancing with the banker's daughter, of Mrs. Potter watching from the sidelines with a satisfied smile. But mostly she was aware of Jackson, his hand strong at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers, the slight smile that seemed reserved just for her. "Everyone's watching us," she murmured as he guided her through a turn. "Let them," he replied. "I'm not hiding how I feel about you, Penelope." "Not tonight, not ever again." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "And how do you feel about me, Jackson Silvercrest?" He drew her slightly closer, still maintaining propriety but making his intentions clear to anyone watching. "I love you," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, here on this ranch, in that house in the meadow if you'll have it, if you'll have me." Though they'd expressed their feelings in private, hearing the words here, in public, with the entire community as witnesses, gave them a weight and permanence that made Penelope's heart soar. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easily now. "And I think I would like that house in the meadow very much." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Is that a yes, Penelope O'Hara? Will you marry me?" The music continued around them, but for Penelope, time seemed to stop. She looked at this man who had given her not just employment but respect, not just affection but partnership, who saw her strength as complementary to his own rather than threatening, who had been waiting, all unknowing, for someone exactly like her since that spring day when he'd read his mother's final wishes. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Silvercrest." He pulled her closer then, propriety be damned, and kissed her right there on the dance floor, to the cheers and applause of the gathered guests. When they broke apart, both flushed and laughing, James was there with glasses of champagne and a grin that threatened to split his face. "About time," he said, handing them each a glass. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the stable together until you came to your senses." Jackson's arm went around Penelope's waist. "Your matchmaking skills weren't needed after all, little brother, weren't they?" James raised his glass in a toast. "To Mother, whose wisdom continues to guide us even now, and to the future mistress of Silvercrest Ranch, who's already brought more life and laughter to this place than we've seen in years." Penelope blushed but raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she added, "and unexpected journeys." "To us," Jackson said quietly, his eyes on hers as they clinked their glasses together, "and all the midnights to come." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dancing, congratulations, and joy. The entire community seemed genuinely pleased by the engagement. Any initial curiosity about the mysterious midnight helper giving way to acceptance, as they saw how clearly Jackson and Penelope belonged together. It was well past midnight when the last guests departed, leaving the Silvercrest brothers and Penelope to survey the aftermath of the celebration. "I'd say that was a success," James declared, loosening his tie. "Best harvest dance we've ever had, in fact." "It was wonderful," Penelope agreed, leaning comfortably against Jackson's side. "Though I should check on the mares. I've neglected my duties tonight." "I had Pete look in on them," Jackson said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "All quiet in the stables. Your shift is covered for tonight." James coughed discreetly. "I think I'll turn in. Long day tomorrow." He kissed Penelope's cheek and clapped his brother on the shoulder. "Congratulations again, both of you. Mother would be delighted." After he left, Jackson turned to Penelope, taking both her hands in his. "Are you happy?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Truly happy with this decision, Penelope considered the question seriously, knowing he deserved an honest answer. "I came west looking for independence," she said slowly. "For a chance to build a life on my own terms without relying on anyone else." A shadow crossed Jackson's face, but she squeezed his hands reassuringly. "What I've found with you is different from what I imagined," she continued. "But it's not a compromise or a settling. It's a partnership. You don't want to possess me or control me. You want to build something with me." She smiled up at him. "Yes, Jackson, I am truly, deeply happy with this decision." The relief in his eyes was palpable. "I want to give you everything, Penelope. The ranch, the house in the meadow, a family if you want one. But most of all, I want to give you the freedom to be exactly who you are. And that," she said, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him, "is why I love you." They married on the first day of spring the following year, in a simple ceremony held in the meadow beside the now completed house. Penelope wore a gown of ivory silk, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Jackson waited for her beneath an arch of budding branches, his expression one of absolute wonder as James escorted her toward him. The town minister presided, but the words that moved Penelope most were those Jackson spoke directly to her as they exchanged rings. "I've been waiting for you all my life," he said, his voice carrying clearly to the gathered guests. "Since before I knew what I was waiting for, since before I understood what it meant to truly share a life with someone." He slipped the gold band onto her finger. "I promise to walk beside you, not in front of you, to value your strength as much as your gentleness, to love you completely, but never possessively, for all the days of our life together." Penelope blinked back tears as she placed his ring on his finger. "I came west seeking independence, and found instead a different kind of freedom, the freedom to love and be loved without fear or reservation. I promise to be your partner in all things, to share your burdens and your joys, to build a life with you that honors both our dreams. To love you completely and faithfully, for all the days of our life together." The celebration afterward was joyous, with dancing and feasting that lasted well into the night. But the moment Penelope treasured most came later, when she and Jackson stood on the porch of their new home, looking out over the moonlit meadow and the ranch beyond. "Welcome home, Mrs. Silvercrest," he said, his arm around her waist. "It's strange," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "When I took that midnight job at your ranch, I had no idea I was actually finding my way home for the first time since I left Pennsylvania." Jackson turned her in his arms, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Do you ever regret it? Answering that advertisement? Coming here?" Penelope reached up to touch his face, marveling that this man was now her husband, that this place was now her home. "Never," she said honestly. "It was the best decision I ever made." His kiss was tender, full of promise and passion in equal measure. And as he swept her into his arms to carry her over the threshold into their new life together, Penelope knew that she had found something far more precious than the independence she'd sought when she headed west. She had found a love that expanded rather than limited her, a partnership that made her stronger rather than diminishing her. She had found a man who had been waiting for her since spring, though neither of them had known it until that fateful night when she took the midnight job at the Cowboy's ranch, and in finding him, she had finally, truly come home. 10 years later, Penelope stood on the porch of their meadow house, watching as Jackson taught their 8-year-old son to ride his new pony. Little William, named for her lost brother, sat tall in the saddle, his face a miniature version of his father's with her honey-blonde hair and determined chin. Beside her, 6-year-old Margaret clutched a book of horse drawings, her blue eyes so like Jackson's intent on her brother's lesson. "Mama, when can I have a pony?" Margaret asked, tugging at Penelope's skirt. "When you're a bit taller, sweetheart," Penelope answered, smoothing her daughter's dark curls. "But you can still help in the stables with the new foals." The child's face brightened. "Like you did when you first came here, when you worked at midnight." Penelope smiled at the story that had become family legend, told and retold at bedtimes and family gatherings. "Yes, just like that, though you won't have to stay up all night like I did." Silvercrest Ranch had flourished in the decade since their marriage. The horse breeding program that had been Jackson's passion had grown into one of the most respected in Colorado, with buyers coming from as far as California and Texas for their stock. The cattle operation, now primarily managed by James, had expanded as well, making the ranch one of the most prosperous in the region. But the true measure of their success, Penelope thought as she watched her husband and son, was the family they had built together. Not just the children, though William and Margaret were blessings beyond measure, but the community they'd created. The ranch hands who had stayed with them for years, becoming almost like family themselves. Mrs. Potter, now retired but still living in a comfortable cottage on the property, who doted on the children as if they were her own grandchildren. James, who had finally married the banker's daughter 2 years earlier and now had a toddler of his own. "He's a natural," Jackson said, coming up the porch steps after handing William off to Pete, now the ranch foreman, for the rest of his lesson. "Just like his mother." "Flatterer," Penelope teased, accepting his kiss. "He takes after you in everything, including his stubbornness." Jackson scooped Margaret up, settling her on his hip despite her growing size. "And this one's all you always with her nose in a book, asking questions I can't answer." "Papa, will you read to me tonight?" Margaret asked, wrapping her arms around his neck. "The one about the horse that could fly." "Of course, princess." He set her down gently. "Why don't you go help your brother with Thunder? Make sure he remembers to give him an apple after his ride." As Margaret ran off to join her brother, Jackson turned to Penelope, his expression softening as it always did when they had a moment alone. 10 years of marriage had only deepened the connection between them. The partnership they'd forged stronger for the challenges they'd weathered together: difficult births, harsh winters, the occasional financial strain when cattle prices fell. "Happy?" he asked, just as he had that night after the harvest dance when he'd proposed. Penelope smiled, leaning into his embrace as they watched their children across the meadow. "Completely," she answered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She thought sometimes of that frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, down to her last few dollars, and desperate for any honest work. How astonished that version of herself would be to see her life now mistress of a prosperous ranch, mother to 2 beautiful children, partner to a man who still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked, his arm warm around her waist. "About how sometimes the thing you're running from turns out to be the thing you're actually running toward," she said, turning in his embrace to look up at him. "I thought I was seeking independence, but what I really wanted was to belong somewhere. To someone. To me," he said, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners the way they did when he was deeply content. "Just as I belong to you. Always," Penelope agreed, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him, "since that very first midnight." And as the sun began to set over Silvercrest Ranch, painting the meadow in shades of gold reminiscent of that first evening ride when Jackson had shown her the foundations of their future home, Penelope gave thanks once again for the advertisement that had brought her west, for the courage that had led her to take the midnight job at the Cowboy's ranch, and for the love that had been waiting for her since spring.